Hi there. In this lecture, I felt it might be useful to do an actual diagram, and this diagram shows the Steinitz elements in the center here. So we've got the static features of the position and the dynamic features in the center. And so we should be aware the dynamic features, they can quickly evaporate. We might need to act on them pretty quickly. If pieces are away from the opponent's king, or we have a lead in development, or the opponent's king is in the center, we should be aware of the need to underline and show that as a downside if needed. We might need to sacrifice a piece, for example, or even our queen, and for example, try and checkmate the opponent if the opponent's king is in the center. So the dynamic features, we need a lot of tactical combinations sometimes to exploit that. Our awareness of forcing moves, limiting the opponent's replies, that's often essential to tactics and combinations to exploit the dynamic features of positions. The more static features of positions, like better pawn structure, strong and weak squares, we can more gradually, potentially, accumulate those as long as the opponent's counterplay is not too large. We've always got to be aware of the opponent's counterplay and our king safety whilst trying to tackle those longer elements of the position, longer term elements of the position. So, for example, we could get carried away, causing structural damage on the queen side, but it's no good if our king is getting mated. So anyway, the general longer term plans are based on the slower moving elements of the position, which are usually pawn structure related, which is why I like to treat the pawn structure as the kind of storage device of the chessboard, so you can accumulate advantages. So this whole shift towards positional play was accentuating the static features of positions rather than more wild, tactical, chaotic openings. You start to see, Lasker with d4, very positional openings, not the king's gambit, trying to accumulate advantages systematically. And he felt, it was better in general to stand in an advantageous position before going on to any attack. Why risk complexity of tactics, etc., when you can actually instead play a more positional opening? And at the time, players were perhaps not as used to those more positional openings and seemed to be quite unaware that pawns don't go backwards. This is a major bit of advice nowadays. Grandmasters like David Norwood have emphasised that in lectures. And this shift towards tactical openings to positional openings may have caused people not to really factor in the longer term considerations, and quite often reckless pawn moves were ruining games quite a lot. That's like a major feature of this early part of Lasker's career particularly, as well as this also kind of extra long-termism, when sometimes it's the particular nuances of positions rather than a grand plan which could decide games. It seems as if there was a bias for certain annotators maybe to show their grand strategy, how fantastic they were, and perhaps they were annotating games in terms of, they had this all planned, 20 moves ahead. But in reality of the chessboard, it's slight little nuances of positions can make all the difference, and you might need to adapt plans entirely. Shorter term, plans are usually much more robust, and you can gain feedback more quickly on them, and they exploit particular immediate downsides of positions sometimes, like weakness of the last move. So anyway, the Steinitz kind of mindset, Steinitz identified elements of the position, so he worked on this core part, in my view, and Lasker essentially created even more detailed examples, and that makes all the elements basically much more formidable, especially when you can swap one element for another to get potentially a more exploitable advantage in position. Maybe your pieces are slightly more aligned to a backward d-pawn rather than the opponents having double pawns. So actually sometimes undoubling the opponent's pawns, giving them a backward d-pawn, you might be in a greater position to exploit that. But by having more detailed examples of both the static and the dynamic features of positions, the idea of swapping one advantage for another is more possible. There's a greater resolution of what is being swapped for what, and if you're clear on why, okay, your pieces are in a much better position to take advantage of, say, a backward pawn rather than the double pawns, then that's great. So in my view, Lasker added resolution to this core center of this diagram where we see the static and dynamic features. So by adding resolution, greater exploitability, greater tradability of elements, swapping one for another. Even static for dynamic, you can give up pawn structure for dynamic play. That's done all the time in the form of, for example, the isolated queen's pawn is an iconic example used by many world champions to create many brilliant games, like Bobby Fischer often winning brilliancies with an isolated queen's pawn. So that's an example of trading off a static feature of the position, seemingly a vulnerable pawn, for the dynamic features it offers. It offers those hooks for a knight, for example, on e4 if you're playing black, and then maybe knight takes f2 needs to be checked out. So the static and dynamic are in balance, trade-offable for each other. To try and maximize your exploitability, a weakness is only a weakness if it's actually exploitable. So the other thing that Lasker adds, which I've depicted on this diagram, is the whole context of these elements. Steinitz treated his opponents as if he didn't really care. He wanted to play the position and nothing else. He didn't care who he was playing. Lasker, on the other hand, thought there was good mileage, especially if you're playing it in a match against a particular opponent over several games. You might want to tint your best move of the position. And, for example, modern grandmasters like Topalov feel that the best move, he's expressed that the best move is based on the circumstances. You might desperately need a win. Your opponent might be some guru in a certain opening, King's Indian defense. You might want to avoid that. So the best move is a contextual thing in Topalov's view. And he's a very, very fantastically results-oriented player, won many tournaments, very highly respected super grandmaster. So he saw there's no such thing as the best move, basically. You need to absorb the whole context of the situation. For me, for example, on YouTube, I play a lot of King's Gambits, and that's something I have in common with Emanuel Lasker. In many of his simultaneous exhibitions, he would play a lot of gambits to add a bit of spice and entertainment value to make it more exciting for spectators. So things really haven't changed that much. There's this bias basically creeping in from these contextual factors. You might be very low on the clock, so you might want to play moves, practical moves. It's a common thing nowadays, just play practical moves. The experienced tournament player quite often, in general, doesn't try and find the scientifically correct move. Quite often the absolute best move, if it's going to take half an hour to find, they might just be content with a safe move which slightly improves the possession and takes less time to actually play. So we factor in the clock situations or the competitive context. Do we really need a win, or is a draw enough? Maybe if you're with the white pieces and your opponent plays the French defence, if a draw's enough, maybe the best move is the exchange variation of the French defence. So sometimes the openings will encapsulate a little bit of the context. They reflect the context. Bobby Fischer, when playing against Mikhail Tal in one of the major Blitz tournaments, played a very, very solid opening. He's never really played in his normal career, a kind of Fianchetto hybrid with the London system. So also, factoring in the opponent's strengths and weaknesses. If the opponent's a tactical genius and brilliant with attacking your king, you might want to play a super solid opening. So do they like to attack? Do they hate early queen trades? Are they bad at endgames? All of that could be factored in, even into the opening phase of a game, which kind of usually sets the scene and tone for the rest of the game. So these contextual factors are all brought in. I mean, these are just examples here for this diagram. I mean, there are more you can think about. But yeah, I mean, chess is not just, we're not just playing against robots, and we are human. We have our own mood, energy level, enthusiasm, and on a particular day you might not want a sharp tactical encounter, so you keep the opening maybe a bit quieter, stick more to what you know rather than being adventurous. And there's other, going back to the competitive context, top right. For example, you might actually have a tournament where you don't actually even need to win, or games you don't need to win. So you might want to explore your weaknesses in your game. You might want to experiment with the isolated queen's pawn just to learn about the isolated queen's pawn, or the French defence just to learn a bit more about pawn chain undermining. So you might switch openings to ones you're bad at. But I know if there's a key performance, like for me, Lloyd's Under 18, Chess for Tigers was influential for maximising my performance for that particular event. I chose openings I statistically had the highest, wins, draw, loss rate. But in other tournaments where you want to become a more well-rounded player in the longer term, you might want to experiment with openings you're bad at to find out why you're actually bad at that. The reason that you might be bad, for example, playing against, let's say, Queen's Pawn, is that maybe you're a bit overconfident, it's a structural weakness, and you don't factor in the opponent's counterplay, and you end up being zapped. Your king gets exposed. So somehow you've got to, against the dynamic structures, build that skill set of counterplay removal or minimization, and look at the positional players more and more for their model game examples, like Karpov, like Michael Adams, to get better at playing against isolated Queen's Pawn. So there might be certain games, training tournaments, where you're not even trying to win, you're just trying to learn. Yeah. So the best move is in the context of these things. But when we're trying to maximize our performance, sure, we choose our best, most proven strategies. Steinitz, by contrast, actually, it seems he inserted some experimental moves in major matches. Perhaps he shouldn't have done that against Lasker. Maybe he should have kept those for private training matches against other players. So the modern player, the modern strategy is based, in my view, of absorbing the whole context of things. If you're a YouTuber or an entertainer streamer, you'd want to play entertaining openings which are ridiculous and maybe unsound, but maybe get the views. So all of this, puts the original Steinitz elements in context and in a greater resolution if more and more examples can be found, and in a greater exploitability context if we can actually swap out particular advantages for others which are more aligned to our piece configuration. Then we're in a better position to actually tap into, for example, a backward pawn rather than a double pawn. It's taking things out of the cupboard in the opponent's position. You might want to translate a structural defect into switch to attack their king, because maybe actually you can actually attack their king instead of going after a structural defect. So this constant conversion to see alignment, to get alignment basically of where your exact pieces are in relation to these weaknesses, are they actually exploitable, basically, is the key question. So anyway, this is I hope that this has kind of highlighted the three key things that I wanted to really show. The advance from Steinitz and Lasker to, they created the modern positional kind of world of chess, the universal world of chess between them. Steinitz, in a nutshell, introduced this inner core, the features of positions, the elements or features of position. And then Lasker added, in my view, a greater resolution, greater exploitability emphasis, and greater context for the use of those elements. So I hope that's clarified a few things. And when you explore the games, I hope maybe you'll be in some agreement with this kind of model of what's going on. Okay, thanks very much.